This guy is our main character. He is an instructor at the prestigious Magic Academy. On his very first day, he taught his students how to use magic 3 times faster than usual. Then, he cast a spell in just half a second, instantly shaking the entire academy. But that's because he isn't an ordinary teacher. He comes from a military background, having survived countless life and death battles. And on top of that, his master is the world's only immortal vampire. A normal person is considered powerful if they master 5 elements, but this guy has mastered more than 10. So, here's how his story began. Our protagonist lost his father at a very young age. Ever since then, his mother kept insisting that he was meant to become a shaman. According to her, he had the qualities of one, and spirits were always protecting him. She even warned that if he refused this path, a terrifying wrath would eventually fall upon him, so she kept forcing all sorts of religious practices on him. But the boy had already planned out his own future, and couldn't accept any of it. Instead, he completely focused on his studies. After grinding hard for 10 years, he died in a traffic accident. In his final moments, unable to believe what was happening, he wondered if this was the very wrath his mother had always talked about. Things got even crazier when he was reborn. For him, the idea of life after death had always been impossible to believe, yet now it was real. In the end, he realized that everything his mother had told him was actually true. At the train station, well-dressed passengers waited for their transportation. Everyone handed their tickets to the conductor before boarding, and the professor stood in line like the others. When the conductor asked for his ticket, the man immediately presented it and thanked him. After checking it, the conductor allowed him to board and wished him a pleasant journey. Once inside, the professor quickly searched for his cabin, located in the 4th compartment, 3rd room. Arriving at room 403, he opened the door and found an old bearded man sitting in a chair, reading a newspaper. The elderly man greeted him warmly, saying it was a pleasure to meet him, and the young professor responded with a small, polite smile as he entered. With steam billowing out, the train departed and began moving through the icy mountains toward its final destination. The 2 passengers sat across from each other, quietly reading, until something in the old man's newspaper caught the professor's attention. He noticed that the civil war in the Yuta kingdom had ended, with the princess's faction emerging victorious. Commenting on the news, the professor remarked that the war had finally come to an end. The old man replied that he had often wondered whether the conflict would ever end. The professor added that it felt like only yesterday when the prince's faction had begun gathering forces, and now everything was finally over. After apologizing for not introducing himself earlier, the professor revealed his name as Rudiger Chelsea. The old man introduced himself as Gerard, mentioning that he had no surname and assuming that Rudiger was a noble. Rudiger confirmed this, but explained that his family had fallen into decline. When Rudiger asked about Gerard's destination, he learned that the old man was traveling to Lindenborough, the capital of the empire. Rudiger commented that traveling through the Exilian Empire was enjoyable because of its advanced magical engineering. He then revealed that he was heading to Leatherbelk after being appointed as a teacher at Theorn Academy in Exilian. Gerard remarked that Rudiger must be exceptionally talented to achieve such a position at such a young age, but Rudiger modestly replied that he had barely passed. The old man explained that most people never even come close to succeeding, making it something to be proud of. Thanking Gerard, Rudiger then brought up a rumor connected to the Civil War. According to the stories, the true reason behind the princess faction's victory was neither a mage nor a knight, but an ordinary wandering mercenary named Machiavelli. Gerard showed no reaction and simply said that he had assumed it was nothing more than a false rumor. However, the rumor was actually true. Machiavelli was one of the identities once used by our OG MC before changing his name. Ignoring the topic, Gerard asked whether Rudiger would begin teaching at Theorn Academy immediately after arriving. Rudiger confirmed that he would, explaining that he had been assigned to teach second-year students. Gerard commented that Rudiger must be even more talented than he had claimed. Suddenly, something seemed to click in Gerard's mind, leaving Rudiger confused, so he asked what was wrong. Just as Gerard was about to explain, a massive explosion erupted outside. The train violently shook from the blast, and both passengers struggled to understand what had happened. Rudiger wondered whether the train itself had exploded, but the old man pointed out that the train was protected by powerful magic and should not have been easily damaged. A moment later, Gerard realized what was happening and concluded that they were under attack and being robbed. He suggested that the attackers were probably targeting a wealthy merchant or noble. Rudiger pointed out that if such an attack was taking place, there was likely a mage among the assailants. Gerard proposed either hiding or escaping, but Rudiger volunteered to move ahead first as a precaution. As they stepped out of the cabin, Rudiger realized that they were the only passengers in the 4th compartment. Gerard wondered whether the other passengers were still inside their cabins, considering the train was protected by magic. However, the cabins were no longer safe because the train's exterior had been protected by the same spell. The two noticed that the explosion had occurred in the 3rd pavilion and questioned why the intruders had not entered it yet. Gerard pointed out that if they were ordinary thieves, they would have headed straight for the 1st pavilion where the nobles were staying, making Rudiger understand their true target. While discussing an escape plan, a thief suddenly began smashing the window behind them. Startled, The two quickly jumped back as the glass shattered and the bandit climbed inside. Rudiger ordered Gerard to stay back while he stepped forward with his cane in hand. Gerard noticed that the bandits did not appear to be in a normal state. Without hesitation, a masked attacker rushed toward them, and Rudiger instantly cast a blue sphere of energy. The spell struck the bandit, electrocuting him and throwing him backward. The masked man collapsed, completely paralyzed by the electricity. When Gerard asked if the man had been defeated, Rudiger explained that he had only temporarily immobilized him. Ignoring Gerard's warning that it was dangerous, Rudiger began interrogating the thief. Placing his foot on the bandit's chest, he demanded to know why they had attacked the train. The masked man could barely speak and only grunted before suddenly bursting into laughter. Annoyed, Rudiger ordered him to stop and answer properly. Filled with hatred and agony, the thief declared that people like Rudiger deserved to be eradicated. Suddenly, he opened his coat and revealed a bomb strapped to his chest. The timer showed that only 1 second remained. Gerard immediately shouted for Rudiger to run, but before he could react, the bomb exploded in a massive blast that devastated everything nearby. Thick smoke engulfed the ruined train, scattering debris everywhere. Although covered in dust, Gerard remained unharmed and called out to check on Rudiger. However, amidst the dense smoke, there was no sign of him, only a crack in the train wall. As Gerard looked outside searching for Rudiger, something caught his attention. He noticed the skin on his face peeling away with ease. Cursing the money he had spent, he removed the disguise and revealed his true appearance, a young man with long hair. This man was the story's true protagonist. The protagonist wondered why incidents like this always seemed to follow him. He had never possessed a deep reason for using the alias Machiavelli. He had simply liked the famous name from his previous life. Because he constantly became involved in major incidents, he had been forced to change identities repeatedly, and Machiavelli was merely one of many names he had used. Living while hiding his identity had become exhausting and irritating. Fortunately, the princess's faction was too busy celebrating their victory to notice his latest disguise. Disguised as Gerard, he had been traveling to Lindenborough aboard the magic train, never expecting a train robbery to ruin everything. Tossing away his mask, he stared at the hole left by the explosion and silently wished that Rudiger, who had seemingly died in the blast, could rest in peace. After all, he had never imagined that someone would detonate a bomb while being electrocuted, since ordinary thieves never behaved that way. Suddenly, the train conductor arrived in shock, unable to understand what had happened. The protagonist explained that a thief had detonated a bomb and that the first carriage was likely the attacker's real target. The conductor replied that he had been evacuating the passengers. Without warning, the protagonist instantly kicked the conductor down and grabbed him by the neck, asking whether he truly believed such a trick would work on him. The attackers had clearly waited for this particular train to pass through the dangerous mountain range, and with the train's magical protection damaged, they must have had help from someone on the inside. The conductor's fearful expression immediately shifted to anger. Secretly pulling a dagger from his sleeve, he attempted to strike, but the protagonist caught his hand and restrained him. Demanding answers, he asked who they were and what their objective was. Holding the man in place, he threatened to kill him with his own dagger. However, as the conductor screamed, the protagonist sensed something strange in the air. Hearing an unusual sound, he instantly understood what was happening and, acting on instinct, shoved the conductor in front of him. A barrage of scorching bullets immediately tore through the conductor's body. Swiftly avoiding the attack, the protagonist realized the ambush had been carefully planned. Moments later, the attacker kicked open the door with ease, and several masked invaders entered, surprised that anyone had survived the barrage. The protagonist mockingly questioned who they were to speak about life and death. The men prepared to unleash another storm of bullets, but after the protagonist glanced at them strangely, they suddenly found themselves unable to pull their triggers. Shocked, they struggled desperately, unable to understand what was happening, until one of them realized that the protagonist was a mage. While the bandits panicked, the protagonist had already begun preparing another spell. The invaders quickly understood that he had used magic to disable their weapons, but before he could attack, another vortex of blue magic suddenly canceled his spell. Surprised, he realized that there was another mage among the bandits. Soon, a masked figure carrying a staff appeared. The bandits demanded that he surrender if he wanted a less painful death, while the enemy mage assumed that, despite his strength, the protagonist was probably only a fourth-rank mage like himself. The protagonist calmly calculated the situation. 10 minutes had already passed since the explosion, and because the train was still crossing 8 Mountain, reinforcements would not arrive anytime soon. Realizing he could not depend on outside help, he suddenly jumped off the moving train. The bandits were stunned by such a reckless action and sent someone to investigate. Looking outside, the masked mage saw nothing unusual and concluded that the man had leaped to his death out of fear. However, the scout was immediately killed, and the mage soon realized that the protagonist was actually on top of the train. The criminals wondered whether he had used flight magic, questioning whether it was even humanly possible to keep up with a moving train that way. The mage ordered some men to pursue him, while the rest continued toward the first carriage. Several bandits began firing heavy weapons at the train's roof as the protagonist ran across the top. Tracking his movements from inside, the pursuers eventually reached the rear carriage and opened the connecting door. The moment they did, a trap activated, and the doorway erupted in flames. The survivors were astonished that he had managed to prepare such a trap in so little time. One bandit remarked that this mage was unlike any he had ever seen, noting that his movements were precise and efficient, more reminiscent of a hunter or mercenary than a traditional mage. Suddenly, a strange noise echoed throughout the train. The criminal mage quickly realized that the protagonist had separated the train cars and escaped across the roof. Furious at failing to predict such a move, he understood that the protagonist no longer needed to fight them directly. As the train sped through the mountains, the criminals searched desperately for him, but could no longer find him. Even so, they refused to abandon their mission. Having memorized the protagonist's face, the criminal mage became obsessed with killing him. Yet, while making that declaration, he suddenly sensed a tremendous surge of mana. Everyone looked on in shock as the protagonist appeared before them once again, holding a massive spell in his hand. Wearing an intimidating expression, he raised his arm and unleashed the spell before anyone could react. The criminals realized too late that they had fallen into yet another trap. The devastating magic engulfed everything in a blinding flash. As the overwhelming spell raged on, the criminal mage ordered his comrades to flee. Using both his magic and his own body, he desperately tried to counter the attack. When the magic finally subsided, every bandit had collapsed to the ground with smoke rising from their bodies. Just as the protagonist wondered whether it was truly over, he noticed that the enemy mage was still standing. The man had lost an arm and all of his hair, while half of his face had been burned away. Even in that condition, the mage questioned why the protagonist had destroyed his group and asked whether he felt any remorse, claiming that his comrades had dedicated their strength to this world. Irritated beyond measure, the protagonist replied that he had never expected the bandits to be so insane. Filled with anger, he reminded the man that they had tried to kill him first, and that expecting sympathy was absurd. He further questioned who the bandit was to judge him when they had been the ones hunting him. Initially, the protagonist had only intended to escape the train, but everything changed once the bandit saw his real face without a disguise. Knowing they would pursue him in the future, he decided it was safer to eliminate them now. Before the enemy mage could ask who he truly was, an ice spell suddenly cut him in half. Caught off guard, the protagonist turned and saw a woman dressed in elegant clothing, armor, and a white cape standing in the carriage. Calmly, she asked whether he was all right, and assured him that he could relax now. Confidently introducing herself, she declared that the Cold Steel Knights had arrived, and that everything would be fine. The bandits are stunned when they see the Cold Steel Knights arrive using flight magic despite the harsh weather. As the criminals open fire, the knights effortlessly defend themselves with magic. In an instant, the knights prepare their own spells and charge toward the armed thieves. Beneath their masks, the criminals can only show expressions of pure terror. The last thing many of them see is a Cold Steel Knight striking them with a powerful spell, followed by a blinding flash and a deafening sound that brings an end to everyone in that carriage. Using earpieces to communicate, the knights systematically move through the train, clearing each carriage and eliminating the remaining bandits. After the operation is complete, Vice Captain Veronica DeVille reports that every carriage has been secured. Thanking her subordinates for their efforts, she orders them to escort the passengers safely to the next station. Soon, the passengers disembark at Leatherbelk Station. While seated in his new spot, the protagonist is approached by Veronica, who asks if he is unharmed. He assures her that he is fine, and thanks the knights for rescuing everyone from the terrorists. Apologizing for not introducing herself earlier, Veronica reveals her name just before someone calls out to her. The newcomer asks whether Veronica is the commanding officer of the knights, and she confirms that she is the vice captain. The man then introduces himself as Officer Remulus from the city's police department and questions her about the attack in the Arete Mountains. Veronica explains that all the terrorists have been eliminated, earning Remulus's gratitude. However, he points out that something in the report does not add up. According to him, the train was taken over far too quickly, and the attackers managed to bypass its magical security with ease. Because of this, the authorities suspect that someone on the inside may have assisted the terrorists. Veronica agrees that the theory makes sense, even if it remains unproven. Remulus states that once the culprit is identified, a full investigation will begin. Overhearing the conversation, the protagonist is reassured by Veronica, who says that innocent people have nothing to fear. Although he maintains a calm smile, he immediately realizes how dangerous the situation is. There is nothing suspicious about Gerard's train ticket, since he purchased it legally and boarded normally. The real problem is his appearance. He no longer looks like a man in his 40s, and if the authorities investigate him, they will quickly discover that he was using a fake identity. At best, he could be tortured, and at worst, executed. Escaping is not an option either because too many police officers and knights are stationed around the train. On top of that, Veronica appears to be the type who would show no mercy to criminals, despite her current friendly attitude. Remulus eventually approaches him and explains that it took some time to obtain the passenger list. He reassures the protagonist that they are simply verifying everyone's identities and asks to see his ticket. The protagonist immediately hands it over, and together with a train employee, they confirm that Gerard and Rudiger occupied cabin 403. The officer then asks what happened to the other passenger. The protagonist replies that Gerard died during the explosion while the train was passing through the mountains and fell off a cliff. As Remulus carefully considers the explanation, the protagonist nervously waits waits for his response. At that moment, Veronica steps in and insists that the man should not be treated as a suspect. She explains that he was already fighting the terrorists before the knights even arrived, questioning why he would do such a thing if he were working with the criminals. Shocked by this revelation, Remulus immediately apologizes. He then addresses the protagonist as Rudiger and asks whether he was recently hired by Thorn Academy. Both Veronica and Remulus suddenly view him differently, seeing him in a new light. Taking advantage of the misunderstanding, the protagonist picks up his suitcase, smiles, and confirms that he is indeed Rudiger Chelsea, the newly appointed professor at Thorn Academy. Soon, they finally reach their destination. Remulus apologized for the inconvenience caused during the journey, but Rudiger thanked both him and the knights for the support and comfort they had provided. The officer even offered to personally escort Rudiger to Thorn Academy, explaining that as someone who would educate the Empire's future generations, he deserved special treatment. However, being escorted by both the police and the knights would only create more problems for the protagonist. He politely declined, claiming that he had some personal matters to take care of first. Thanking them for the brief but pleasant meeting, he took his leave. Veronica also thanked him and expressed her hope that they would meet again someday. With that, Rudiger, the master of disguises, quickly disappeared into the crowd. Walking alone through the streets, the protagonist felt relieved to have escaped the attention of both the police and the knights. Internally, he apologized to the real Rudiger, but since assuming the dead man's identity had helped him survive, he had little choice. He was especially grateful that photographic technology in this world was still primitive, making it nearly impossible for anyone to distinguish him from Rudiger through pictures. Confident that everything would work out, he began considering creating yet another new identity. However, before he could act, someone suddenly called out to him as Sir Rudiger. The elderly man introduced himself as Wilford, an employee of Thorn Academy. Relieved to see that Rudiger was safe, Wilford explained that he had come to escort him after hearing about the train attack. With no real alternative, Rudiger entered Wilford's carriage. Although it was horse-drawn, it also operated using mechanical gears. Sitting on the luxurious red couch inside, Rudiger sank into deep thought. He quickly realized that the situation was far from ideal. The Academy had not sent an ordinary employee to receive him. Besides possessing a powerful physique, Wilford had approached without Rudiger sensing his presence at all. At the very least, Rudiger believed the man was probably a knight. Attempting to flee with weak excuses would only raise suspicion and likely cause Wilford to pursue him. After some thought, he decided to remain calm and continue acting as Rudiger. Since Gerard was officially dead, he was essentially a ghost in this country. Even if he vanished, nobody would notice. Maintaining Rudiger's identity was clearly the safest option. Before long, they arrived at Thorn Academy, and the gates opened for the carriage. The protagonist was immediately stunned by the Academy's magnificent appearance. The enormous grounds, complete with a grand central garden, looked absolutely breathtaking. In disbelief, he wondered if everything before him truly belonged to Thorn Academy. Wilford informed him that he would take him directly to the Academy's director and asked him to leave his luggage behind. Soon, Rudiger stood before an enormous structure resembling a white castle. Upon entering, he found himself inside a vast hall decorated with exquisite ornaments. Introducing himself as Rudiger Chelsea, he announced that he had arrived in response to the summons. At the far end of the room sat a woman wearing a complicated and unreadable expression. She introduced herself as Elisa Willow, the director of Thorn Academy, and stated that she had eagerly awaited Rudiger's arrival. Elisa asked whether he had been injured during the attack, and Rudiger assured her that he was unharmed thanks to the knights. Pleased by his answer, she explained that the Academy's reputation would have suffered had anything happened to him. Rudiger found her comments somewhat unsettling, especially since she seemed more concerned about the Academy's image than his well-being. Ever since entering the Academy, he had been feeling uneasy. He could not stop wondering whether Elisa had already realized that he was not the real Rudiger, or whether she had ever met the genuine Rudiger in person. Elisa remarked that Rudiger was quite handsome, and mentioned that this was their first face-to-face meeting. Relieved, he thanked her for the compliment. The director then handed him a contract. Although she had already informed him of the details beforehand, Elisa wanted to review everything once more. The contract guaranteed a 2-year position, complete with the promised salary, accommodation, and meals. As Rudiger carefully read through the document, he was shocked to discover that the salary amounted to 30 imperial gold coins, equivalent to roughly 300 million won. Elisa asked for his opinion and reassured him that the offer was extremely generous. Outwardly, Rudiger remained calm and simply stated that the terms seemed satisfactory. Internally, however, he felt as though he had won the lottery. At the same time, he realized that such an incredible salary meant the Academy expected extraordinary results from its professors. Rudiger ultimately decided to adapt to this new environment and meet the Academy's expectations. Refusing the position after traveling all the way to Thorn would only make him suspicious. Since he had no other choice, he resolved to fully embrace his role, deceive those around him if necessary, and survive for the next 2 years. After reviewing the contract, he informed Elisa that everything was perfect and that no changes were necessary. With his extensive real-life experience and vast theoretical knowledge, he was confident that he could convincingly play the role of an excellent professor. Elisa extended her hand and expressed her eagerness to work with Professor Rudiger Chelsea. As Rudiger shook her hand, he reminded himself that he only had to endure this life for 2 years before finally becoming a free man. Night falls, and the full moon shines over the buildings of Thorn Academy. Rudiger has 3 weeks before classes begin, and he believes that is more than enough time to prepare. He even finds it amusing that the academy was willing to provide an entire house just for him. As he relaxes in his room, the reality of his new life as a professor finally begins to sink in. He also remembers that it has already been 27 years since he reincarnated into this world. Unlike many others, he was reborn without any special abilities and only retained the memories of his previous life. In that former life, he had been forced to survive on his own because of his neglectful parents. After enduring countless hardships, he never imagined that he would one day become a professor at Thorn Academy. Even now, he considers this new life nothing more than another disguise he was forced to adopt. Since he needed a fresh identity, Rudiger Chelsea had been the perfect target. The real Rudiger was a fallen noble from a small kingdom, an only child whose parents had already passed away. The letters he had received during his lifetime seemed purely formal and showed no signs of close relationships or friendships, making him the ideal person to impersonate. In Rudiger's eyes, there could not have been a better identity to steal. However, there is still one thing he lacks: information about Thorn Academy and the subjects he is expected to teach. Before he can focus on that, hunger gets the better of him, so he decides to leave those concerns for tomorrow and heads out in search of a restaurant. The following day, Rudiger is seen sitting in a cafe with a cup of coffee in hand. He realizes that 2 weeks have already passed. During that time, he finished handling his pending matters and prepared most of his lectures. With only 1 week remaining before classes begin, he now needs to put everything into practice. Since it is still early and customers have not yet started arriving, he decides to continue preparing his lessons. Suddenly, a hooded figure sits behind him and says that they are relieved to see that he is safe. The stranger explains that they had been worried something terrible had happened to him. Although surprised, the master of disguise remains silent and continues sipping his coffee. The hooded figure asks why he failed to make contact during the past 2 weeks, and mentions that the organization's members have been curious about both his whereabouts and those of the First Order. Not understanding what the stranger is talking about, the protagonist carefully stays quiet. He soon realizes that these people are actually searching for the real Rudiger Chelsea, the very identity he stole. Nervously, the hooded figure explains that the terrorist attack on the train was merely an accident and that they had no idea rebels would attack. Taking advantage of the situation, Rudiger says that he needs information about Thorn Academy. Shocked, the hooded figure asks whether no information had been sent to him at all. Rudiger calmly replies that he was only verifying whether the information he had already received was accurate. Internally, however, the protagonist remains confused and struggles to understand who these people truly are. Deciding that exposing himself would be dangerous, he chooses to continue playing along and asks whether they completed their mission. The girl explains that before arriving, they eliminated all the important figures within the academy. She further reveals that traitors inside their organization were brutally executed and even fed to dogs. Hearing this, the protagonist finally understands how serious the situation is and realizes that the real Rudiger had been involved with an extremely dangerous organization. Trying his best to remain calm, he asks why she suddenly came looking for him. The girl replies that his sudden disappearance for half a month had raised concerns. Acting irritated, Rudiger asks whether she decided to act on her own during such a crucial period. Startled by his harsh tone, she immediately apologizes. Rudiger then slams his teacup onto the table and orders her to stay quiet, adding that her suspicious appearance had already been bothering him. From her fearful reaction, he realizes that this organization deeply fears the man known as Rudiger Chelsea. Wanting to learn more, Rudiger asks how many members have successfully gathered. The purple-haired girl answers that 31 Second Order members and 7 Third Order members have already infiltrated the academy, while the First Order members arrived earlier and completed their preparations as planned. After confirming the numbers, Rudiger orders her to stand up. The girl then mentions that they can proceed to the predetermined location for their next meeting. However, Rudiger immediately intimidates her, asking whether someone beneath him believes they have the authority to order him around. Terrified, the girl begins trembling and desperately begs for forgiveness. Rudiger coldly states that he alone will decide when the next meeting takes place, and that only individuals of his status have the right to organize such gatherings. Still shaking in fear, the girl asks whether people like him belong to Order Zero. Rudiger neither denies nor confirms it, and simply tells her not to bother him with trivial matters. Turning around, Rudiger leaves while internally realizing just how dangerous these people truly are. Beyond assassinating key figures within the academy, he cannot even imagine what else they might have done to their so-called traitors. Just as he is about to leave, the hooded girl suddenly calls out for him to wait. Though nervous, Rudiger decides to hear what she has to say. She asks when he plans to summon them again and how he intends to send the order. Internally, the protagonist panics because he never thought that far ahead. Hiding his confusion behind a threatening tone, he asks whether he really needs to explain something so obvious. Finally, Rudiger returns to his room and begins investigating the identity he has taken for himself. During his research, he discovers that Rudiger Chelsea was a fallen aristocrat with no remaining family ties. He was also known as the fastest person to reach rank 4 and had earned a position as a professor at Thorn Academy. Irritated, the protagonist realizes that he should have suspected something much earlier. The reason Rudiger appeared to be such an ideal candidate was because the identity itself had been carefully created for a specific purpose. After all, the real Rudiger could not use his true identity to infiltrate the academy. As he continues examining Rudiger's belongings, he discovers that the letters sent and received under the name Rudiger Chelsea were actually coded messages. Realizing just how deep and complicated the situation truly is, the protagonist feels overwhelmed. He cannot believe that the impulsive decision he made has thrown him directly into the center of a massive conspiracy. While reading through the correspondence, he notices that Rudiger communicated using encrypted messages written in the Queden language. Although the strange writing raises doubts, the bigger issue is the existence of First Order members infiltrating Thorn Academy. The fact that someone from a secret organization managed to become a professor and receive special treatment during the selection process seems incredibly suspicious. The protagonist knows that more instructions from the organization will eventually arrive, and Thorn Academy is no longer his only concern. The more he thinks about his situation, the more absurd it becomes, giving him a terrible headache. The idea that an executive of a secret organization died in a terrorist attack feels completely ridiculous. Rudiger was an important figure who had planted dozens of spies inside Thorn, so someone of his status should have survived both the train hijacking and the bombing. Eventually, the protagonist realizes that complaining about a dead man is pointless. However, the reality remains the same. He must now hide not only his own identity, but also maintain the facade of an entire secret organization. After reflecting on the situation, he decides that contacting the organization might be necessary. Based on the information he has gathered, the organization is divided into 4 different orders, beginning with Order 0. Although he has no information about Order 0 itself, he is now certain that it exists. His greatest concern is discovering who was sent by the organization. If that individual personally knew the real Rudiger, they could immediately expose him as an imposter. For now, the protagonist's highest priority is ensuring that nobody uncovers his disguise. Ideally, he wants to manipulate events in a way that causes Thorn Academy to eliminate the secret organization on its own. Since Thorn possesses immense power, he believes the organization would stand no chance if the Academy decided to act against it. At the same time, he must provide just enough information to each side to avoid arousing suspicion from either of them. Simply thinking about the dangerous balancing act required to satisfy both organizations leaves him mentally exhausted. Even so, he knows that he cannot afford to waste the next 2 years. As the sun rises over the magnificent Thorn Academy, students fill the hallways, chatting with one another before class. Inside a spacious classroom, students begin taking their seats while discussing the arrival of their new professor. Many have heard that he is highly skilled, although they doubt that his appointment was planned, considering that the previous professor resigned so suddenly. The conversation soon shifts to a recent incident in which a student publicly defeated a professor. One student points out that people are talking about Flora, but she innocently asks what she did wrong. According to Flora, she had merely corrected a mistake in the professor's magical technique because she believed it was incorrect. Meanwhile, other students continue discussing the new professor. They mention that he is a sophisticated scholar who has written several academic theses and previously served as a military officer. Excited by this information, one student adds that he is also a fallen noble. Hearing this, many students become disappointed, assuming that such a professor would probably hand out easy grades. However, their discussion abruptly ends when the new professor confidently enters the classroom. Slamming his hand on the desk, the protagonist introduces himself as Rudiger Chelsea and states that he looks forward to teaching them. The entire classroom immediately falls silent, caught off guard by his sudden and imposing entrance. Rudiger explains that since the academy is currently in a course adjustment period, he will not begin teaching the subject immediately. Even so, he warns everyone that his spellcasting classes will focus primarily on practical training rather than theory. He also reveals that the class will not be restricted to second-year students, as first-year students will be allowed to attend as well. Although students begin complaining, Rudiger quickly silences them and makes it clear that he has no intention of making the course easier. A blonde, blue-eyed girl, carrying herself with noble arrogance, raises her hand and asks why freshmen are being included in a second-year class. Rudiger replies that, as an educator, it is his responsibility to teach everyone equally, regardless of their academic year. The student points out that his class structure differs from the academy's standard format and asks for a more detailed explanation. Rudiger simply answers that revealing everything now would ruin the fun and encourages her to attend his classes if she wishes to learn more. Rudiger then addresses those who believe they will receive easy grades simply because he is a new professor. He warns them that they will deeply regret such assumptions and openly advises anyone expecting an easy course not to attend his class at all. Although he has prepared his lessons thoroughly, he secretly thinks that teaching fewer students would be much more convenient. After all, forcing second-year students to study alongside freshmen would naturally damage their pride, and he doubts many would willingly join a difficult class after hearing his warning. After finishing his introduction, Rudiger asks whether anyone has questions. However, the students remain silent. The atmosphere created by a former military officer, combined with his reputation as the youngest person ever to achieve rank 4, leaves no one brave enough to speak. Satisfied, Rudiger ends the introductory session and leaves the classroom. He is surprised that nobody even asked basic questions about him, which he initially considers a positive outcome since the answers he had prepared are now unnecessary. However, he soon begins overthinking the situation and wonders whether the students are intentionally avoiding him. Concerned that he may have appeared too intimidating, he questions whether he should have acted in a friendlier manner. Lost in these thoughts, he suddenly notices several fellow professors approaching him. His suspicion that others might be ignoring him immediately proves false. A pink-haired woman politely introduces herself as Selena and mentions that she is also a newly appointed professor. Rudiger greets her courteously, and she warmly asks whether he has already eaten lunch. Through Selena, Rudiger is introduced to Bruno, the professor responsible for golem summoning classes, and Marilda, who teaches allurement, illusions, curses, and dispelling magic. Rudiger introduces himself in return as the new professor of spellcasting. One of the female professors compliments him, remarking that he is even more handsome in person. Nearby, a blue-haired professor wearing glasses glances at Rudiger with a strange expression, before immediately looking away when noticed. Marilda introduces him as Professor Chris Benamor and notes that he belongs to a noble family. Observing the group, Rudiger realizes that among the new professors there is one fallen noble, one active noble, and 3 commoners. Despite their vastly different social standings, they are all exceptionally talented. This leads him to suspect that one of them could be a member of the mysterious First Order, making it impossible for him to fully trust any of his colleagues. Suddenly, Chris declares that he cannot tolerate staying with the group any longer. He admits that he had been curious about the new professors, but scoffs at the fact that the group consists of only one fallen noble and several commoners, stating that he wants nothing to do with them. He also tells Rudiger not to pretend to be a noble when he is merely a fallen one. Marilda immediately intervenes, pointing out that Chris's noble status does not justify such behavior, and she asks Rudiger not to take the insult personally. Rather than responding, Rudiger politely tells the others to enjoy their meal without him, though Bruno enthusiastically suggests eating together instead. In the end, Rudiger reflects that, at the very least, he no longer has to eat alone as he usually does. Night finally falls over Theorn Academy. Inside a room, a glowing blue magic circle shines brightly as several students communicate through it. One of them brings up the new professor, Rudiger Chelsea, mentioning the rumors surrounding him. According to those rumors, he is the youngest person ever to reach rank 4, has experience as a military officer, participated in the cryptid hunt, and even engraved his name in a magic tower. A girl with her hand placed on the magic circle asks whether all of those stories are actually true. Thinking to herself, she realizes that she cannot interfere with the First Order's plans. In fact, she wants to send as many students as possible to Rudiger's class. Another student uses the communication magic to ask whether first-year students are allowed to enroll in his course. The other students find the idea fascinating and begin considering joining the class as well. As time passes, Rudiger walks through the academy corridors, ready to deliver his very first lecture. He wonders how many students remained after he openly warned everyone that his classes would be difficult. He assumes that the students who returned probably did so because they had no alternative rather than genuine interest. In his mind, at most 30 students would attend his class, while the other professors' classrooms would be overcrowded. Meanwhile, the students chat among themselves while waiting for their professor. However, when Rudiger finally enters the classroom, he is completely stunned. Every single one of the 80 seats is occupied. Even more surprising, most of the students are first years, and they already appear to respect him. Rudiger wonders whether they truly feel no pressure attending classes alongside upperclassmen. He suspects that someone may have manipulated the situation, though he also considers the possibility that he simply underestimated the students' competitive spirit. Since Theorn Academy gathers the continent's brightest young talents, he realizes that his earlier challenge may have only motivated them further. Accepting the situation, Rudiger introduces himself once again for the benefit of the new students, and reminds everyone that he teaches spellcasting. He knows that he will now have to work much harder than expected. The lesson begins when a student asks about the 4 specialization processes. Wearing a stern expression, Rudiger immediately states that questions may only be asked with his permission. He warns the class that anyone who disobeys his instructions will lose points, although students can also earn bonus points through effort and performance. Answering the original question, he explains that he intends to teach all 4 major specializations: release, attributed elements, telekinesis, and reinforcement. Since most professors struggle to teach even 2 of these fields, Many students are surprised that a newly appointed professor plans to teach all 4. Among them, the blue-haired second-year student Flora privately judges Rudiger, believing that his plans are nothing more than an exaggeration. Taking advantage of the fact that this is his first lecture, Rudiger decides to impress his students. He introduces a rank 3 fire element spell known as Flickering Flame. He explains that the spell functions by using release to trigger combustion before compressing, expanding, and accelerating it, with 7 different components working together to create the final result. What he intends to demonstrate is a method for casting this spell 3 times faster than normal. The students immediately question whether such a feat is even possible. A blonde student asks Flora for her opinion, and Flora confidently replies that she does not believe it can be done. She explains that existing methods, such as scroll storage and memory reverberation, have clear limitations, and she warns that she will be disappointed if Rudiger relies on either technique. Expecting many questions, Rudiger opens the floor to the class. Both first and second-year students bombard him with questions, asking whether he modified the spell itself. Rudiger clarifies that altering the technique would create an entirely different spell. Instead, he plans to preserve the original spell while drastically reducing its casting time. At that moment, Flora raises her hand and firmly declares that such a feat is impossible. Observing her calmly, Rudiger listens as she introduces herself as Flora Lumos, a second-year student. The entire class immediately pays attention, realizing that Flora intends to challenge the professor. When Rudiger asks why she believes his claim is impossible, Flora explains that modern magical theory states that faster casting can only be achieved through repetition and experience. She argues that even history's greatest geniuses have never accomplished what he is proposing. In response, Rudiger asks whether it is possible that mages simply refuse to improve existing methods. He explains that magic has stagnated because society remains overly attached to tradition. Although scientific advancements have threatened magic's place in the world, Rudiger insists that magic itself can continue evolving. He makes it clear that he does not advocate scientific superiority, but firmly believes that magical techniques can be improved. Therefore, he declares that Flora is mistaken and states that someone must become the first person to advance magic. Shocked by his confidence, Flora questions whether he truly believes his own words, finding him incredibly arrogant. Finding further explanations insufficient, Rudiger decides to demonstrate his theory. He asks Flora about the average casting time for Flickering Flame. Flora answers that, depending on the mage's rank, the average ranges between 5 and 10 seconds. Rudiger states that he dislikes evaluating students based solely on rank, and instead prefers teaching methods tailored to each individual. Flora then refines her answer, claiming that the average is approximately 5 seconds, and confidently adding that she can cast it even faster. Recognizing her confidence, Rudiger invites her to demonstrate in front of the class. Flora immediately accepts and confidently steps forward. Waving her wand, she begins casting Flickering Flame. Within moments, the spell's magic circle forms in the air. The students are amazed by her speed, although they expected no less from a member of the prestigious Lumos family. Rudiger measures her casting time at 4.78 seconds, an extraordinary result for a second-year student. He admits that her execution was flawless, but still judges it to be too slow. Since the fastest recorded casting time for a rank 3 mage is 4.41 seconds, he states that even that record remains insufficient. The entire classroom is stunned when Rudiger declares that even 4.4 seconds is far too slow, and wonders just how quickly he can cast the spell himself. Telling the students to watch carefully, Rudiger prepares to demonstrate. The moment he raises his wand, Flora notices that his movements do not correspond to the standard Flickering Flame technique. Then, in an instant, the spell is completed, leaving the entire classroom speechless. It had not even taken a full second. Seeing their stunned expressions, Rudiger asks whether everyone managed to observe the process and immediately casts the spell again, once more finishing in less than a second. The students react with complete astonishment. Checking the time, Rudiger calmly announces that his casting speed was precisely 0.24 seconds, a dramatic improvement over the current record. Flora points out that his first casting did not resemble the standard version of Flickering Flame. Rudiger explains that he used one spell to accelerate the casting of another. By preparing specific conditions beforehand, he can instantly trigger predetermined results. He compares the process to a programming system. A mage's body functions as biological hardware, mana serves as data, techniques act as programs, and magic itself becomes software. He refers to this revolutionary concept as source code, a term completely unfamiliar to Flora and the other students. After finishing his explanation, Rudiger asks Flora whether her question has been answered. She reluctantly admits that it has. He then points out that she interrupted his class without permission because she allowed her own prejudices to influence her judgment. When he asks whether she acknowledges her mistake, Flora reluctantly agrees. Rudiger declares that challenging his authority without justification deserves punishment and deducts 10 points from her score. The harsh penalty shocks both Flora and her friends, and she appears on the verge of tears as she quietly returns to her seat. However, Rudiger immediately adds that because her execution of Flickering Flame was flawless, he is awarding her 10 bonus points. Since he respects talented students, her excellent technique deserves recognition. Relieved, Flora thanks him, and the rest of the class relaxes after realizing that the penalty was effectively cancelled out. Although Flora reassures her concerned friend Cheryl that she is fine, she remains deep in thought, clearly struggling internally after everything that happened. With the matter settled, Rudiger removes his coat and officially begins the lesson. He announces that he will personally select a few students capable of keeping up with his teaching in order to introduce them to source code. Finally, he tells the entire class that anyone who truly wishes to learn must work hard to earn that opportunity. The students are thoroughly impressed. Many had expected a terrible class because of the rumors surrounding Rudiger, but instead, they discover a lecture worthy of Thorn Academy's prestigious reputation. Some time passes, and Professor Rudiger finally decides to end the lesson. Since the class has already covered advanced material, he dismisses the students and tells them to review everything they learned. Deeply impressed by the concept of source code, the students cannot stop discussing the lecture. However, not everyone shares their excitement. A snobbish aristocrat mocks the amazed students, calling them idiots. The arrogant blonde noble sneers that this is exactly why commoners are worthless. The student, targeted by his insults, does not even realize that the comments are directed at him. Annoyed, the rich boy asks whether the commoner is mocking him, but the student quickly denies it. Furious, the noble demands to know how a mere commoner dares ignore Jevon, the eldest son of Baron Filio. At that moment, Leo arrives and casually asks whether Baron Filio's territory is not located on the outskirts of the Empire. Becoming even more irritated, Jevon sarcastically questions whether Thorn Academy now accepts just anyone. Leo calmly replies that accepting ordinary students is still better than admitting the foolish son of a childish baron. Enraged by the insult, Jevon begins preparing a spell. In response, Leo simply stares at him with complete disdain and dares him to cast it. He points out that even nobles cannot break academy rules without consequences, and asks whether Jevon even bothered reading those rules before enrolling. Leo also reminds him that he had been loudly shouting in a room still full of witnesses. Completely humiliated, Jevon grits his teeth, looks around, and finally storms away after warning Leo to prepare himself for what comes next. Grateful for the help, the bespectacled student introduces himself as Aiden. Leo introduces himself in return and says that there is no need to thank him because he simply dislikes arrogant nobles like Jevon. Ignoring that explanation, Aiden enthusiastically declares that Leo is amazing and says that he is thrilled to have met him. Leo attempts to leave, but Aiden insists on following him, despite not even knowing where he is going. Spotting an alchemy book in Leo's hands, Aiden excitedly mentions that he also studies alchemy. Only mildly interested, Leo tells him to do as he pleases. However, he warns Aiden not to repeat the strange gesture he made earlier. Confused, Aiden asks whether Leo means hand signals or the movements of someone inexperienced with magic. Leo explains that Aiden first needs to understand how things work at Thorn Academy because second-year students already possess strong foundations. To illustrate his point, he brings up Flora Lumos, the student who challenged Professor Rudiger during class. According to Leo, Flora is exceptionally talented, but has a terrifying personality, and he advises Aiden to avoid her. Rumors within the academy even claim that the previous spellcasting professor resigned because of her. Leo then mentions another student to avoid, Arendir von Exilion, the Empire's third princess. He warns Aiden that nothing good ever comes from commoners trying to interact with her. Finally, Leo brings up Proyden Walberg, the leader of the second-year noble faction. When Aiden asks whether he belongs to the famous Walberg family, one of the Empire's 3 wealthiest and most influential ducal houses, Leo confirms it. He explains that members of that family view commoners as little more than insects, and should be avoided at all costs. He also points out that Jevon belongs to Proyden's faction, meaning Aiden has likely already drawn their attention. Aiden casually says that he does not care, leaving Leo unable to decide whether the boy is incredibly brave or simply insane. Leo mentions that there are still several other nobles Aiden should stay away from, and decides to explain them along the way. Unbeknownst to them, a white-haired man with an aristocratic appearance silently watches their conversation from afar. Meanwhile, Rudiger walks through the academy corridors while reflecting on his first lesson. To his surprise, it went far better than he expected. He notes that despite the existence of magic, this world still resembles 19th century Earth in many ways, and lacks the technological advancements of the 21st century. This gap between science and magic was precisely what inspired him to create the concept of source code by combining both fields. Even so, he never expected the students to respond so positively. When his master first saw source code, he merely confirmed that the theory worked. Although it allowed Rudiger to cast magic more quickly, his master pointed out that he was still limited to rank 3, and that creating entirely new magic remained incredibly difficult. Rudiger also knows that he cannot continue using source code too frequently, or others may eventually uncover his secrets. Stopping in front of an ornate door, Rudiger wonders whether it is his personal office. Opening it, he finds an enormous room and a white-haired woman waiting inside. She welcomes him and asks whether he likes the elegant interior, explaining that Thorn Academy provides professors with private offices where they are free to do as they wish. Impressed, Rudiger asks why she is in his office. Rather than taking offense, the The woman simply asks whether she was not allowed to enter. Rudiger clarifies that he is merely curious about the purpose of her visit. The woman, director Elisa Willow, explains that Rudiger is a valuable professor and therefore deserves special attention. However, the moment their eyes meet, Rudiger feels his entire body tremble beneath Elisa's piercing gaze. Noticing his reaction, Elisa comments that she expected him to be surprised, although Rudiger internally thinks that after everything he has experienced today, even encountering a ghost at midnight would not startle him. Elisa informs him that the other professors were astonished by his abilities. Rudiger immediately wonders whether she visited the other professors as well, or whether she specifically came to see him. Unable to determine her true intentions, he begins to suspect that she may have noticed something suspicious about him. Since Thorn Academy secretly harbors members of a hidden organization, he considers the possibility that Elisa has already sensed unusual activity and has become suspicious of him. Such suspicion would be unfair, he thinks, because while the real Rudiger belonged to that organization, he does not. Elisa then mentions hearing that he accepted many students into his class. Rudiger explains that he did not want to discriminate based on academic year. To his surprise, Elisa agrees with his decision, and even points out that several first-year students possess extraordinary talent, including one who uses unusual magic. The director then asks Rudiger to avoid unnecessary trouble, especially because the third princess is enrolled in his class. While the princess does not require special treatment, any incident involving her would create serious problems. Surprised by this revelation, Rudiger listens as Elisa tells him that she has high expectations for him. She is also pleased that his first class received overwhelmingly positive evaluations from the students. Rudiger politely offers her some tea, but Elisa declines, explaining that she still has many responsibilities to attend to. Before leaving, she asks him to take care of himself. Outside the office, an elderly man asks Elisa how the meeting went and whether Rudiger can be trusted. Elisa honestly admits that she does not know yet, and reveals that she is currently watching the Academy's two most suspicious individuals. Although she has not reached any conclusions, the old man remarks that she must have good reason to be concerned. Elisa agrees, and reveals that she used her charming gaze on Rudiger twice during their conversation. To her surprise, he remained completely unaffected both times. Reflecting on the encounter, she notes that an ordinary rank 4 mage should have succumbed to her ability, yet Rudiger resisted it solely through sheer willpower. Because of this, Elisa concludes that he is truly an extraordinary man. Thinking about the recent terrorist attack, the hidden organization operating within Thorn, and the possibility that the train attack may have served as a distraction to replace Rudiger, she realizes that she cannot ignore even the smallest details. Asking Wilford for his opinion, she learns that although he cannot explain why, his instincts tell him that Rudiger is unusual. Since Wilford possesses exceptional judgment when it comes to people, Elisa takes his intuition seriously and decides that she must continue observing Professor Rudiger for a much longer time before she can uncover his true nature. Meanwhile, back in his private office, Rudiger collapses onto the sofa in exhaustion. Frustrated, he realizes that his conversation with Director Elisa had not been a friendly meeting at all. It had been an interrogation. Although he remains anxious, he knows that he has not done anything suspicious and decides to continue focusing on his role as a professor. As he reviews information about his students, he hopes that Flora's family will not pressure him over the incident in class. After all, he believes Flora has no reason to take it personally, since he eventually rewarded her with points and resolved the situation fairly. Looking through more student files, he notices many exceptionally talented individuals, ranging from students supported by the Magic Tower to members of the Imperial family. When he comes across Aiden's file, he wonders if Aiden is the student Elisa referred to as possessing unusual magic. Rudiger feels that the boy's face seems strangely familiar, though he cannot remember why. Even so, he knows he cannot lower his guard after witnessing how closely Elisa had been observing him. Caught in a dilemma, Rudiger begins questioning whether he should side with Thorn Academy or the secret organization. After all, the mysterious girl had immediately accepted his changed appearance and addressed him as Sir First Order without hesitation. He briefly considers the possibility that the real Rudiger was an expert in disguise and infiltration, but quickly dismisses the thought. Aligning himself with the secret society would be extremely dangerous, and there is no guarantee that they would protect him even if he faithfully served their cause. For now, he concludes that the only sensible option is to perform his duties as a professor to the best of his ability. Suddenly, someone knocks on his office door. A courier stands outside and hands him an official patrol warrant. Rudiger recalls that his contract mentioned mandatory patrol duties, and today happens to be his assigned turn. The courier quickly departs after delivering the document, while Rudiger shows little enthusiasm about having to carry out the patrol. Later that night, inside one of the Academy's training halls, a blonde, noble girl aggressively orders another student to leave. The other girl refuses, arguing that the training area is shared space that any student can use. The blonde responds by insulting her and calling her a commoner. In return, The girl calmly points out that Thorn Academy does not classify students according to status or nobility. Scoffing at this, the blonde Diama claims that such ideals exist only to appease commoners. The surrounding nobles join in, mocking the girl and insisting that poor people are foolish for trying to rise above their place. Realizing that these petty nobles will never listen to reason, the commoner decides to walk away. Her decision only infuriates Diama further. Outraged that a commoner dared ignore her, Diama raises her wand and begins casting a spell. Blue streaks of magical energy erupt from a magic circle and race toward the defenseless girl. Even the other arrogant nobles are shocked by Diama's reckless behavior. Terrified, the girl screams as the spell rapidly approaches. However, just before it can strike her, the magic is suddenly disrupted and vanishes into thin air. Furious, Diama demands to know who interfered. A calm voice questions what exactly is happening and points out that using magic outside the designated training grounds without proper supervision is unacceptable. The voice further condemns the attack as unfair and wonders how such an incident could occur so early in the school year. The person who stopped the attack is none other than Professor Rudiger, standing there with his wand still raised. Relieved, the commoner girl watches as Rudiger sternly remarks that the situation makes Thorn Academy look ridiculous. He states that he would have overlooked the matter if it had merely been harmless training, but deliberately attacking another student is a completely different issue. Diama protests, claiming that she was only protecting noble authority. However, Rudiger firmly declares that every student at Thorn Academy is equal, regardless of noble blood, and that he cannot ignore what just happened. He immediately orders Diama to come with him. Irritated, the girl responds by calling Rudiger a fallen noble. The moment those words leave her mouth, fear immediately grips her, and the surrounding students are horrified by what she has just said. Slowly turning toward her, Rudiger's expression becomes terrifying. Filled with fury, he asks her to repeat what she just said. The atmosphere instantly becomes so oppressive that everyone present freezes in fear. Thorn G at her with an overwhelming presence. Rudiger asks whether she truly called him a fallen noble. One of the students hurriedly calls for Professor Selena to intervene. Shocked by the scene, Selena shouts Rudiger's name in an attempt to stop him. With his hand raised, Rudiger appears ready to act, and everyone braces for the worst. However, instead of attacking, he calmly places his hand on Diama's shoulder. Trembling, the girl prepares herself for punishment, but Rudiger unexpectedly tells her that she is correct. Confused, she asks what he means. Rudiger explains that, as she said, he is indeed nothing more than a fallen noble. Nevertheless, within Thorn Academy, he is still a professor, and insulting him in such a manner is equivalent to challenging his authority. Keeping his hand on her shoulder, he gently asks whether he is wrong. Rudiger then adds that adjusting to an unfamiliar environment must be difficult for someone so young. Because of that, he decides to overlook the insult as a warning. However, he makes it clear that she will still receive proper disciplinary punishment for attacking another student. Turning toward the commoner, Lin, Rudiger asks whether she was injured. After she assures him that she is unharmed, he visibly relaxes. Entrusting the rest of the matter to Professor Selena, Rudiger quietly leaves. Lin is stunned that Rudiger even remembered her name. As one commoner among 80 noble students, she never imagined that a professor would pay attention to her. Remembering his words about all students being equal at Thorn, she begins to trust him. Although she once thought Rudiger was simply a frightening professor, she now feels inspired to work harder than ever before. Later that night, Rudiger sits alone on a bench, resting his head in his hand while clearly suffering from intense pain. Pulling a strange vial from his coat, he swallows several pills to ease his symptoms. He realizes that without these pills, which have helped him survive until now, he would be in serious trouble. Annoyed, Rudiger wonders why that commotion had to occur at exactly the wrong moment. He had already begun experiencing symptoms as soon as he entered the training hall. While the initial discomfort had been manageable, his condition worsened throughout the confrontation. By the middle of the discussion, all he could think about was escaping before anyone noticed his condition. Then, just as things reached their worst, Diama insulted him at the perfect, or rather, worst possible time. Fortunately, he managed to respond convincingly despite his deteriorating state. However, after taking the final pill from the bottle, he realizes that he can only endure for another 5 days. Worse still, if an emergency forces him to use mana during that time, his condition could worsen even further. Purchasing more medicine from a pharmacy is not an option because such a transaction would be recorded, making it extremely dangerous. Realizing he has no other choice, Rudiger decides that he must contact a specific person. The next day at Thorn Academy, Selena brings up rumors about a werewolf. Confused, Rudiger asks her what she means, and Selena eagerly repeats that students reportedly saw a shadow moving across the rooftops the previous night. Rudiger dismisses it as nothing more than a ghost story or an urban legend, and Selena initially agrees. However, she explains that several witnesses claim to have seen the same figure inside Thorn itself. She admits that people may have mistaken something else for a monster, but strange events are not uncommon at the academy. Selena then mentions Thorn's famous 7 ghost stories and asks whether Rudiger has heard of them. When he questions whether those stories are actually true, she insists that they are. Realizing that Selena seems unusually passionate about ghost stories, Rudiger comments on it. Embarrassed, Selena hurriedly explains that she only researches such stories to discuss them with her students. When she begins over-explaining and denying any obsession, Rudiger calmly tells her to relax. Marilda soon changes the topic and asks about the fascinating technique Rudiger demonstrated during his first class, the one capable of drastically reducing spellcasting time. She wants to know its name, but before Rudiger can answer, Selena excitedly blurts out that it is called source code, creating an awkward atmosphere. Now aware of its name, Marilda asks whether such magic truly exists, and Rudiger confirms that it does. Both professors are amazed that a technique can alter the very process of casting magic. The conversation quickly attracts the attention of the other professors in the dining hall, making Rudiger uncomfortable. Marilda remarks that rumors about source code have spread throughout the academy and asks whether Rudiger would consider demonstrating it publicly. Selena adds that he could even obtain a patent from the magic tower. Internally, however, Rudiger knows that seeking a patent would be dangerous. Without powerful backing, his work could be stolen, or he himself could become a target. The last thing he wants is for the magic tower to become too interested in him. What troubles him even more is the intense curiosity displayed by the other professors, including Chris Benamor. That evening, as darkness falls and the full moon rises over Thorn, Rudiger hides behind a building while waiting for someone. Growing impatient, he wonders what is taking so long, and speculates that the person might be wandering around nearby. In reality, the individual is already standing directly behind him. A werewolf silently emerges from the shadows and suddenly attacks with its massive claws. Rudiger effortlessly dodges the swift strike by shifting his body and immediately counters with a kick that sends the creature flying. Rudiger comments that he had been wondering what was taking so long, and now realizes that it was merely a prank. The werewolf sarcastically asks whether it would have hurt Rudiger to at least pretend to be surprised. Standing up, the werewolf greets him warmly and calls him Big Brother. Rudiger responds that it has indeed been a long time since they last met and addresses him as Hans, remarking that Hans never stops causing trouble wherever he goes. Rudiger asks about Hans's current appearance, and Hans complains that he ended up this way because a small dog bit him. Rudiger mocks his natural constitution, which annoys Hans because it is actually the result of a curse. Hans possesses a condition known as the beast factor, causing him to transform into whichever creature bites him. If bitten by a cat, he becomes cat-like. This time, because he was bitten by a dog, he transformed into a canine beast. Hans asks whether Rudiger brought a convergent, and Rudiger reveals a syringe filled with green liquid. After injecting himself, Hans instantly returns to normal, and remarks that he would have suffered much longer without Rudiger. Their first meeting had occurred when Rudiger was sent to hunt a dangerous beast that turned out to be a giant chihuahua. If Hans had not spoken to him back then, he would have been killed. Changing the subject, Hans almost uses Rudiger's real name, but Rudiger immediately corrects him. Hans remembers seeing the name Rudiger Chelsea in the letter and asks why his friend chose to become a professor at Thorn after asking to meet in the capital. Rudiger explains that it was his only option. When Hans asks whether the real Rudiger belonged to a secret society, Rudiger confirms that he was a First Order member. Hans recalls that mysterious newcomers had recently appeared in the underworld calling themselves the Order. When Rudiger asks for the organization's name, Hans reveals that it is known as the Black Dawn Society. Everything suddenly makes sense to Rudiger. He explains that he escaped death purely by luck and that even the smallest mistake could expose him. After agreeing that the situation is dangerous, Rudiger asks Hans about the briefcase he requested. Hans hands it over, still sealed, insisting that he would never be reckless enough to open Rudiger's belongings. Rudiger remarks that both of them are now dependent on medicine to survive. He also asks why Hans did not contact him earlier, since the werewolf sightings began 2 days ago. To Rudiger's surprise, Hans insists that he only arrived in Leatherbelk today. A heavy silence follows. Both men suddenly notice something moving across the rooftops. To their shock, a real werewolf is standing there beneath the full moon, hiding themselves. Hans whispers that the creature has not noticed them and suggests escaping immediately. Rudiger disagrees, reasoning that the beast is clearly hunting and would detect any sudden movement. Looking more closely, he notices that the werewolf is wearing a collar. This convinces him that someone deliberately released it. While Hans wonders who could be responsible, Rudiger decides to investigate and draws his revolver. Hans comments that it has been years since he last saw Rudiger use that weapon, remembering that during their hunting days, Rudiger always wore a mask. Back then, he was known as Abraham Van Helsing, a vampire hunter. Sensing movement, the werewolf turns toward Rudiger. With one hand casually resting in his pocket and showing no hostility, Rudiger calmly approaches the beast. The creature bares its fangs, drools hungrily, and suddenly leaps directly in front of him. Up close, Rudiger confirms that the collar is real, strengthening his suspicion that someone is controlling the monster. He decides that capturing and interrogating it will provide answers. The werewolf lets out a loud howl before launching a series of furious claw attacks. Rudiger effortlessly evades every strike with the help of blue magic circles appearing beneath beneath his feet. After the beast's final lunge leaves it trapped against a wall, it charges again in a frenzy. Maintaining a calm expression and a slight smile, Rudiger activates the magic circles he previously placed across the ground. The circles rise into the air, expand, and release waves of ultrasonic energy. The attack instantly incapacitates the werewolf, leaving it deafened, stunned, and clutching its ears in agony. Watching from hiding, Hans wonders what happened. Rudiger explains that he used ultrasonic waves that ordinary humans cannot hear. Taking out a syringe, he remarks that there is no need to waste expensive silver bullets. He intends to capture the creature and discover who created it. Unfortunately, just as he is about to inject it, he hears approaching police sirens. At the worst possible moment, the werewolf recovers, leaps back onto the rooftops, and escapes. Refusing to let it get away, Rudiger fires a grappling hook concealed beneath his sleeve, attaching it to the rooftop and using the chain to pursue the fleeing monster. From above, he watches the beast sprint across the rooftops on all fours at incredible speed, while police officers below begin searching the area for suspicious individuals. Meanwhile, Rudiger continues pursuing the werewolf across the rooftops at incredible speed. The lycanthrope races ahead on all fours, but Rudiger steadily closes the distance. The chase continues from rooftop to rooftop until the monster suddenly stops. Its glowing eyes lock onto Rudiger as he lands on top of a train parked at the railway terminal. Facing the creature, Rudiger remarks that he originally intended only to subdue it, but the beast has left him with no other choice. As the werewolf prepares to charge once more, Rudiger throws a shuriken. The metal projectile shoots toward the monster at high speed, yet the frenzied beast effortlessly dodges it without slowing down, continuing its charge while drooling and keeping its glowing eyes fixed on its prey. Just as the creature rushes toward him, the shuriken curves back and attempts to strike again. However, the werewolf avoids the returning projectile without even looking at it. Retrieving his weapon, Rudiger admits that the creature possesses remarkable reflexes. Gripping his cane, he declares that this next attack will end the fight. Blue magical energy gathers at the tip of the cane and launches toward the beast. While manipulating the spell with his fingers, Rudiger notices that the werewolf remains unaffected by the approaching energy wave. The monster immediately senses his movement and charges at full speed. Rudiger counters with a heavy strike while secretly throwing another shuriken. This time, the weapon pierces the werewolf's torso, causing it to howl in pain. Rudiger leaps over the beast, preparing a finishing blow, but the creature suddenly bites down on his cane with its sharp teeth, stopping the attack. Using a hidden mechanism, Rudiger draws a concealed sword from inside the cane. The werewolf freezes in surprise as it watches the blade emerge. Pulling back his arm, Rudiger delivers a precise strike directly to the creature's head, ending the battle instantly. Meanwhile, Hans races through narrow alleys, barely avoiding capture while wondering when Rudiger will return. Suddenly, the severed head of the werewolf lands right in front of him. Hans nearly jumps out of his skin in shock before Rudiger calmly appears beside him and asks whether he is surprised. Hans complains that Rudiger could at least warn people before appearing out of nowhere. He also cannot believe that Rudiger plans to leave him alone after everything. When Hans asks why he brought the werewolf's remains, Rudiger casually replies that he only wanted to surprise him. After examining the corpse, Rudiger concludes that the werewolf was actually an artificial cryptid created through experimentation. He then insists that they proceed with their original plan. Although Hans is reluctant, Rudiger argues that settling in Letherbelk is safer than remaining in the capital, and that they should stay in the city for some time. Hans points out that Thirn Academy is already home to both the secret organization and whoever released the cryptid, making the place extremely dangerous. Rudiger counters that any unusual incident will inevitably draw the attention of both groups. He therefore asks Hans to gather information while he remains at the academy. Hans complains about having to work alone, but Rudiger explains that the academy already suspects him, preventing him from taking reckless actions. He asks Hans to continue gathering intelligence and keep him informed until the right moment arrives. Hans eventually agrees, admitting that collecting information is his specialty. Rudiger understands that things are unlikely to proceed smoothly. Even if he cannot act immediately, he still needs to prepare by strengthening his own position. After analyzing the situation, he becomes convinced that an ordinary underground organization could not have created the werewolf. He distinctly remembers seeing a laboratory emblem attached to the creature's collar, and producing an artificial beast of that caliber would require far more resources than a secret society could easily obtain. For now, however, he decides not to dwell on the matter. He already eliminated the creature and wants to avoid becoming involved in further trouble. Later, news spreads throughout the city that the notorious Letherbelk killer has reappeared and is still alive. According to reports, 5 additional murders occurred on Sunday, bringing the total number of victims to 10. Although the culprit's identity remains unknown, witnesses claim that the killer was a black-furred beast. The police publicly label the culprit a lunatic and promise to capture the murderer soon. Rudiger is stunned when he reads the article because he killed the werewolf on Saturday, not Sunday. Realizing this discrepancy, he begins to suspect that there may be more than one werewolf roaming the city. Just then, inside Professor Rudiger's office, the communication orb suddenly begins emitting a blue glow, signaling that someone is attempting to summon him. Soon, a large meeting of Thorn Academy professors is held around the conference table. When Rudiger enters the room, Professor Selena invites him to sit beside her. As he takes his seat, several professors begin whispering among themselves, discussing the revolutionary spell technique he introduced. Selena asks whether he has read the recent news regarding the 2 second-year students who were attacked the previous night. Although the victims survived, they suffered severe injuries and deep scratches resembling those inflicted by a beast. According to one of the students, he briefly regained consciousness during the attack and saw the terrifying creature responsible. Selena concludes that the rumors that had been spreading throughout the week were true, and that there are now actual victims in Leatherbelk. At that moment, another professor announces the arrival of the headmistress and orders everyone to remain silent. Selena quietly informs Rudiger that the woman is Mary Ross, a professor who has served at Thorn for 20 years and oversees pharmacology. Headmistress Mary Ross immediately addresses the faculty, revealing that an unknown assailant recently appeared and brutally attacked 2 students. No one knows who or what carried out the attack, but eyewitnesses insist that the culprit was a black-furred werewolf. One professor, Hugo Borutog, strongly objects to this conclusion. He argues that the appearance of a cryptid inside Thorn is impossible because the academy is protected by the Exilian Empire. According to him, the rumors surrounding a werewolf are nothing more than an urban legend. Mary counters that regardless of his opinion, 2 students have already become victims. Even so, Hugo refuses to believe that a cryptid is responsible. Instead, Hugo asks whether the victims were noble students. When Mary confirms the information, Hugo claims that the culprit is likely a commoner student from the academy. The headmistress is stunned by his accusation, but Hugo insists that only aristocratic students have been targeted so far. While he refuses to accept the existence of a werewolf at Thorn, he is willing to believe that someone disguised themselves as one in order to attack nobles. Listening to the discussion, Rudiger realizes that he had underestimated the internal divisions within Thorn. He had assumed the Black Dawn Society was at a disadvantage, yet the professors themselves seem more interested in blaming one another than cooperating. He cannot help wondering whether this is truly the reality of the continent's most prestigious academy. Suddenly, a spider lands on Rudiger's shoulder. Curious, he picks it up and examines the strange insect. When he crushes it between his fingers, he discovers a hidden note attached to its body. The message states that 3 experimental subjects have escaped and orders him to either capture or eliminate them before anyone else does. If others capture the creatures first, there is a high chance that his identity will be exposed. Concealing the note, Rudiger becomes deeply frustrated and wonders why his life is constantly filled with problems. Noticing his expression, Selena asks whether he is feeling unwell, but Rudiger assures her that everything is fine. He never imagined that the current situation was connected to the Black Dawn Society. Considering how events are unfolding, he doubts that even the organization anticipated these bizarre incidents. However, the possibility of his identity being exposed shocks him. Realizing that he cannot remain passive, Rudiger decides that he must find and eliminate the escaped beasts before the organization does. If his disguise is uncovered, everything will be ruined. Eventually, Headmistress Mary informs Hugo that he may believe whatever he wants, but he must still fulfill his responsibilities. She announces that additional patrols will be organized and orders that students are no longer allowed to leave their dormitories at night. She further warns that any students who violate these restrictions may face disciplinary action. After the professors agree to the new measures, the headmistress officially concludes the meeting. Once outside, Rudiger hears a noise coming from behind him and immediately orders whoever is there to come out. Hidden behind a tree, a girl panics after being discovered. Rudiger recognizes her as the same shy student who had approached him before and is certain that she is disguising herself as an ordinary student. Asking what she wants, he watches as the girl nervously stutters and struggles to speak. Telling her to stop hesitating, Rudiger instructs her to walk with him, and she obediently follows. Awkwardly trying to start a conversation, the girl asks whether the professor likes coffee, leaving Rudiger somewhat confused. The two eventually enter a cafe, sit down, and order coffee. When Rudiger asks for her name, she introduces herself as Sainida Lotion. Noticing that she lacks a commoner surname, he questions whether that is really her true name. Trembling nervously, Sainida insists that it is. Finding the situation strange, Rudiger tells her to stop hesitating and reveal why she followed him. He then casts a spell that blocks all sound around them, surprising Sainida. Rudiger warns her not to call him First Order while they are inside Thorn, and she immediately agrees. Returning to the matter at hand, Rudiger asks Sainida what information she came to report. She explains that the recent werewolf incident is connected to an affiliated organization. According to her, the creature was one of several cryptid experiments created by dark mages from Shamus Academy, a place inhabited by mages expelled from society because of their unethical research. Some of these experiments escaped, and one eventually entered Thorn through the sewer system, leaving victims behind. As Rudiger reacts in surprise, Sainida apologizes for speaking too much, but continues her report. She explains that the organization plans to handle the matter themselves because Rudiger had previously lent his name to the operation under the orders of Victor Dreadpool, another First Order member. Rudiger replies that he had merely lent his name and never expected the situation to escalate this far. In truth, he had almost forgotten about Victor altogether. Sainida then states that the organization must eliminate all 3 escaped experiments. However, Rudiger corrects her by revealing that only 2 remain. Producing the identification collar taken from the werewolf he killed, he shocks Sainita. He explains that he encountered and eliminated one of the escaped laboratory creations 2 days earlier. Looking at Sainita, Rudiger wonders how someone talented enough to infiltrate Thorn as a student remains only a third-order member. He suspects that the Black Dawn Society keeps her in a lower position because she is a noble. Since anti-establishment organizations rarely trust nobles, he believes she is merely being used, and will likely be discarded once she ceases to be useful. Having recently discovered flaws within Thorn Academy itself, Rudiger is surprised to see similar cracks within the Black Dawn Society. He begins considering whether he can somehow benefit from this situation through Sainita. Knowing that the escaped creatures came through the sewers, Sainita plans to expand the search in that area. Rudiger points out that Thorn does not yet possess that information, and Sainita agrees, although she is unsure how long that will remain the case. After hearing her report, Rudiger tells Sainita that he hopes they can meet again if circumstances allow. He also compliments her, saying that she explained things much more clearly this time compared to their first encounter. Delighted by the praise, Sainita watches as Rudiger dispels the sound barrier, stands up, and leaves the cafe. Unknown to both of them, Flora had been observing the scene from outside. Noticing Rudiger using magic inside the cafe, she wonders what kind of conversation required a sound-blocking spell and becomes curious about the identities of the 2 people. Later, during class, Flora remains distracted by what she witnessed. Based on the color of the magic she saw through the window, she is certain that Rudiger cast a spell designed to prevent sound from escaping. Ordinary people cannot perceive the color or scent of magic, but Flora possesses that ability. Unable to stop thinking about it, she wonders what the professor and the mysterious girl discussed in secret. At the end of class, Rudiger warns his students not to believe the rumors surrounding the werewolf and announces that anyone caught spreading such stories will be punished. Despite the warning, the students continue discussing the rumors. Some even consider hunting down the werewolf themselves to claim the reward offered by the city. Another student reminds them that they would be punished if caught, leading some to suggest capturing the beast without anyone finding out. Leo asks Aiden what he thinks about the idea, but Aiden replies that he would rather stay away from the entire situation. Expecting such a cautious answer, Leo asks what he plans to do, and Aiden explains that there have already been victims and that the professors are handling the matter anyway. Suddenly, a red-haired girl slams both hands onto their table and demands their attention. Excitedly, Aiden greets the girl, Tessie, but she ignores him completely. Leo remarks that she already lost and should simply accept it, but Tessie insists that their previous match ended in a draw and tells him not to interfere. Determined, she challenges Aiden to another fight without either of them holding back. Aiden refuses, claiming that he has afternoon classes and that the werewolf incident is far more important. Tessie accuses him of making excuses because he is afraid to fight her. Having no better argument, Aiden openly admits that she is correct. Tessie then proposes settling their competition in another way. When Aiden asks what she means, she declares that whoever captures the werewolf first will be declared the winner. To Aiden's shock, Leo immediately agrees, reasoning that the professors will likely catch the beast anyway. Tessie warns Aiden not to run away out of fear, while Leo tells her not to cry if she loses. After she leaves, Aiden questions why Leo agreed to such a reckless proposal. Leo simply replies that he thought it was reasonable. However, Aiden knows Tessie well enough to realize that she is completely serious. Because she is both reckless and somewhat foolish, he has no doubt that she will truly attempt to hunt the beast. The 2 boys quickly stand up to check on her. Spotting Tessie outside, they initially assume she is heading back to her dormitory and feel relieved. Their relief vanishes when she suddenly changes direction. Watching her determined stride, they immediately realize that Tessie is actually going after the werewolf, leaving them both stunned. At night, Rudiger patrols the streets alone, fully aware that many people are watching his every move. Earlier, Professor Hugo had asked him to stay closer to the noble students and show them more consideration. Rudiger suspects that Hugo must be truly desperate to seek help from a fallen noble. He had even considered that siding with the headmistress would be the wiser choice. Nevertheless, Rudiger firmly believes that within Thorn Academy, there should be no distinction between nobles and commoners. This principle defines his identity as Rudiger Chelsea. As he prepares to continue his patrol, Professor Hugo calls out to stop him. However, Rudiger knows that openly supporting Hugo could expose inconsistencies in his fabricated background. More importantly, he has no desire to oppose the headmistress without good reason. Suddenly, Rudiger senses something unusual nearby. Investigating a bush, he discovers several students secretly spying on him. The professor immediately asks whether they have forgotten that students are forbidden from leaving their dormitories at night. Although the students desperately try to defend themselves, Rudiger remains unmoved and deducts 5 points from each of them. From the number of students sneaking around, he quickly realizes that at least 20 students have already gone out in search of the werewolf bounty. Knowing that simply punishing them will not solve the problem, and that the situation will only worsen, Rudiger decides to hunt the beasts himself before more students become involved. Using the information Sanita provided about the sewer system, he heads toward the sewage treatment facility near Thorn. There, he identifies the exact water pipe through which the monsters entered. Illuminating the area with magic, he confirms that no one else has been there. Soon, he discovers 2 distinct sets of werewolf footprints, one large and one small, both heading in the same direction. Following the tracks deeper into the sewers, Rudiger eventually arrives at a broken iron gate. Examining the area carefully, he realizes that the two creatures separated at this point. Judging by the tracks, the larger werewolf headed toward the academy, most likely in search of prey. Knowing that this beast is the more dangerous of the two, Rudiger would not be surprised if it attacked someone immediately. Just then, a loud, piercing scream echoes through the tunnels. Without hesitation, Rudiger abandons the tracks and rushes toward the source of the sound. When he arrives, he finds a black werewolf attacking two students. Realizing that the girls are in serious danger, he decides to do something he would normally prefer to avoid. Charging forward, he casts a spell, and a magic circle radiating orange energy appears before launching its attack. The werewolf notices the incoming spell too late. Although it instinctively raises its arms to defend itself, the impact still sends the beast flying backward. Rudiger quickly positions himself in front of the collapsed students and recognizes them as Lin and Arendir. To their disbelief, the first thing he does is deduct 5 points from each of them. Both girls stare at him in shock. Arendir immediately protests, arguing that he should have asked whether they were injured first. Rudiger coldly asks whether she believes she performed well enough to justify raising her voice at him. He further remarks that Arendir talks far too much for someone incapable of defending herself. Attempting to protect her friend, Arendir asks Rudiger to transfer Lin's penalty to her instead, explaining that Lin had fallen asleep while studying. Before she can finish, Rudiger interrupts, telling her that she should have thought more carefully about the consequences beforehand. Sensing a sudden change in his demeanor, Arendir falls silent. Rudiger then orders her to escort Lin back to the dormitory, promising to revoke their penalties if they obey. Seeing Arendir's dissatisfied expression, he warns that the penalties will remain if they disobey again. Meanwhile, the werewolf rises to its feet, growling furiously at Rudiger. Although the girls warn him, he had already noticed that the creature survived. Smoke rises from its body where the spell struck, indicating that it suffered only minor injuries. Suddenly, the beast turns and flees. Rudiger immediately pursues it, ordering the girls to evacuate the area. The werewolf races away in fear, climbing walls, and eventually reaching the academy rooftops. Using his grappling hook, Rudiger launches himself onto the buildings and continues the chase. Watching from below, Lin recognizes Rudiger's rooftop movement as a form of levitation magic. Soon, the two opponents face each other atop the academy rooftops, surrounded by towers as another battle begins. The werewolf and Rudiger clash repeatedly, leaping from rooftop to rooftop in a zigzag pattern while exchanging attacks. Neither side manages to land a decisive blow. Eventually, the beast aggressively closes the distance and attempts to slash Rudiger. He narrowly evades the attack and instantly counters with a spell that strikes the creature directly. While the beast is stunned, Rudiger leaps over it and casts another glowing blue spell in midair. Watching the battle, Lin and Arendir are astonished to witness how a true mage fights in actual combat. Enraged, the werewolf retaliates with a charge and a powerful swipe. Before the attack can connect, Rudiger prepares another spell with his staff, releasing a burst of blue energy that strikes the creature squarely in the chest. The impact knocks the beast off the rooftop, but it manages to cling to the edge with its claws. As it struggles to climb back up, Rudiger casts another spell. 2 bolts of energy shoot from a magic circle and hit the creature, finally sending it plummeting from the rooftop. From above, Rudiger watches the werewolf fall and slowly descend from the great height. However, he begins feeling exhausted and realizes that consuming so much mana is dangerous. Since the students are watching, he cannot fight without using magic and wants to finish the battle quickly. To his surprise, the werewolf is still alive. The creature tears a loose section of rooftop free and hurls it at him. Caught off guard, Rudiger barely manages to summon a defensive barrier in time. He is shocked that the beast is capable of using tools during combat. Moments later, the werewolf leaps downward at incredible speed and crashes into the ground, creating a massive impact. Although the attack misses and Rudiger escapes unharmed, he remains deeply unsettled. A creature based on a wolf should not possess intelligence comparable to that of a human. Watching the beast adapt and exploit its surroundings, Rudiger begins questioning whether these monsters are truly werewolves at all. Meanwhile, Aiden and Leo continue searching the forest while calling out for Tessie. Leo begins considering giving up, believing that they will never find her and that she will eventually return on her own. However, Aiden argues that they also share responsibility since they agreed to Tessie's challenge in the first place. Leo asks whether Aiden truly believes that Tessie is searching for the werewolf, and although Aiden cannot speak for everyone else, he is convinced that Tessie would absolutely do something that reckless. In the end, Leo decides that they will continue searching for another 30 minutes, and if they still cannot find her, they will return to the academy. The moment he says this, a loud scream echoes through the forest. Both boys instantly recognize it as Tessie's voice and sprint toward the sound at full speed. As they race through the forest, Aiden suddenly notices something unusual hidden in a nearby bush. For reasons he cannot understand, a severe headache strikes him, causing him to collapse to the ground. Alarmed, Leo rushes to his side. Moments later, they encounter Tessie, who who had also fallen after accidentally crashing into Aiden. Surprised to see them, Tessie asks why they are there, and Aiden explains that they heard her scream. However, Tessie insists that she never screamed at all. The three pause and listen carefully. Tessie then urges them to remain quiet and follow her. Moving cautiously, they sneak toward a nearby bush to investigate the source of the scream. Hidden beneath a pile of leaves, they discover a small werewolf cub. Proudly, Tessie declares that she has won their bet, but Leo immediately points out that merely finding the creature does not count as capturing it. Before Tessie can approach the cub, Aiden notices that it is injured and hiding alone. He points out that such a small and wounded creature could not possibly be responsible for all the recent attacks. Tessie wonders whether that means another werewolf is nearby, but Aiden cannot answer with certainty. However, he does notice signs that someone has been taking care of the cub. Looking more closely, he spots something shining beneath its fur, a chain around its neck. As the students continue examining the cub, a much larger werewolf silently appears behind them. Hot breath escapes from the creature's mouth as it bares its fangs and drools hungrily. Leo senses the monster's presence at the last second and immediately warns Aiden. Just as the werewolf launches its attack, Leo shoves Aiden out of the way and takes the hit himself. The powerful blow sends him flying through the air. Seeing the enormous creature up close, Tessie is horrified to realize that the werewolf is real. Determined to restore her family's honor, she grabs her wand and announces that she will defeat the beast. However, she becomes distracted, and the werewolf immediately slashes at her. Aiden jumps forward without hesitation, embracing Tessie and pushing her aside to save her from the attack. Injured, Leo calls out to Aiden, while Aiden asks whether Tessie is hurt. Confused, Tessie asks why he risked himself for her, and Aiden simply replies that he could never stand by and watch a friend get hurt. Meanwhile, the werewolf remains aggressive and prepared to eliminate the students. Aiden, however, notices something unusual. He suggests that the creature is only acting this way because it is trying to protect its injured cub. Tessie argues that the beast could never understand human speech, but Aiden continues speaking to it anyway, repeatedly assuring the creature that he has no intention of harming its child. Surprisingly, the werewolf gradually becomes less aggressive. Instead of attacking again, it remains still and watches the students. Aiden explains that the creature attacked them earlier solely to protect its cub, and his companions reluctantly agree, asking them to trust him. Aiden slowly steps forward and gestures reassuringly toward the beast. He calmly promises that everything will be fine and offers medicine to ease the cub's suffering. The werewolf appears to understand his intentions and gently reaches out to accept the vial. However, just before it can take the medicine, a spell suddenly strikes it without warning. The powerful magic injures the creature and immediately expands into restraints that bind its arms and imprison it. At that moment, Professor Rudiger appears and demands to know what the three students are doing outside at night. Seeing him, Tessie panics and screams in shock. Rudiger tells them that they can explain themselves later, but Aiden quickly steps forward and asks the professor to wait. He desperately explains that the werewolf understands human language and begs Rudiger to reconsider before killing it. Rudiger dismisses the claim as nonsense. Even so, Aiden continues, suggesting that there is a possibility that the werewolf might actually be human. Before he can finish speaking, Rudiger gives him a cold and disapproving look before forcefully pushing him aside. Terrified by the professor's dark expression, Aiden can only watch as Rudiger raises his staff and conjures a powerful fire spell. Flames rapidly engulf the trapped werewolf, while Rudiger remains standing with his back turned to the students. Without looking back, he informs Aiden that he will be held responsible for his reckless behavior. As Aiden stares fearfully at the blazing flames, Rudiger orders all three students to return to their dormitories immediately. As dawn approaches, the three students feel miserable about being the only ones caught by Professor Rudiger. Tessie notices that Aiden seems unusually quiet, with sadness clearly visible in his eyes. Before long, the headmistress enters the room and asks whether they have been waiting for too long. The three students are stunned to see the headmistress herself appear. They immediately realize that her presence means this will be far more serious than an ordinary disciplinary hearing. When asked what they think about the situation, they nervously remark that this clearly involves more than a simple penalty. Rudiger confirms their fears, telling them that they should already understand how reckless their actions were the previous night. He explains that if even one thing had gone wrong, one of them could have lost their life. The headmistress, however, tells them not to act as though the world has ended and gently suggests that Rudiger should be a little less strict. One of the students protests, arguing that the incident cannot simply be forgotten, even if things ultimately turned out well. Aiden then carefully recounts everything that happened during the encounter with the werewolf. After listening, the headmistress asks whether he was the one who jumped in to save Tessie. Embarrassed, Aiden quietly admits it. Acknowledging both their recklessness and bravery, the headmistress deducts 10 points from each of the students. To their complete surprise, she also awards them 20 merit points for acting courageously in a desperate situation. The trio is left stunned, before immediately becoming overjoyed. The headmistress then asks Rudiger whether he has any objections, but he agrees with her decision. She encourages the students to continue showing the same determination in the future, and the three gratefully thank her. As the students leave, Aiden quietly observes Rudiger. The professor simply looks back at him with tired eyes, saying nothing, while Aiden wonders whether Rudiger is truly satisfied with the outcome. Later, the headmistress admits that she had not expected Rudiger to request that she personally speak with the students. Rudiger explains that it would damage his image if people discovered that he had asked for leniency on their behalf. Understanding his reasoning, she asks whether there was anything unusual about the werewolf. Rudiger replies that there was nothing he could clearly remember. Since there is little else they can do, the headmistress thanks Rudiger for his efforts, noting that no one died because of his actions. She also expresses her expectation that Professor Rudiger will continue performing exceptionally in the future. Alone in his office, Rudiger reflects on the previous night's events. He recalls the werewolf cub and realizes that it had actually been a human body that had not fully transformed into a beast. The madmen responsible for creating these cryptids had not used wolves as their foundation at all. Instead, they had captured humans and transformed them into monstrous werewolves. Even so, Rudiger does not regret killing them. If he had hesitated, he himself could have died, and regardless of their origins, those creatures still harmed innocent people. That fact alone justified his actions. Nevertheless, the memory of the cub desperately trying to protect its father continues to haunt him. Troubled by those thoughts, Rudiger pulls out a magical communication orb and contacts his friend Hans, telling him that he has a request. Meanwhile, the students discuss the merit points they received. Tessie asks Leo whether his injured arm is healing properly, and he assures her that it should recover within a few days. Noticing Aiden's troubled expression, Tessie asks if something is bothering him, but he initially denies it. Eventually, he brings up the strange collar he noticed around the werewolf cub's neck the previous night. Shocked, Tessie accidentally shouts in surprise, forcing Leo to remind her to lower her voice. Aiden explains that the collar was the reason he tried to stop Professor Rudiger. He believes there is a possibility that the werewolves were artificially created. Hearing this, Leo recalls strange rumors about suspicious individuals secretly operating within Thorn. Although he cannot confirm whether the rumors are true, he agrees that a werewolf wearing a collar is undeniably suspicious. The conversation soon shifts toward Rudiger and the unusual expression he showed Aiden during the incident. Aiden insists that, in that moment, Professor Rudiger definitely saw something. Tessie asks whether Aiden believes the professor is hiding something, and Aiden admits that Rudiger must know more than he revealed. However, he would rather believe that he is simply imagining things, because it seems unlikely that a professor would conceal something so serious. Even so, he cannot completely dismiss the possibility that Rudiger is somehow connected to the secret organization mentioned in various rumors. Tessie immediately tells Aiden that he is overthinking everything. She reminds both boys that the headmistress herself said that Rudiger fully reported the incident. If he were truly hiding something, she doubts the headmistress would have spoken so positively about him. Despite her attempts to act indifferent, Tessie firmly believes that Rudiger genuinely protected and helped them. Even after hearing her reasoning, both Leo and Aiden remain suspicious of the professor. Eventually, Aiden agrees with Tessie that there is no point worrying about it right now. Changing the subject, Aiden suddenly remarks that he is starving and invites his friends to eat with him. When he casually asks Tessie to join them for lunch, he is shocked when she happily replies that eating together is simply what friends do. The moment Aiden refers to them as friends, Tessie's face turns bright red. Excited and flustered, she enthusiastically agrees to eat with them, and Aiden becomes equally excited by the idea. Meanwhile, Hans asks Rudiger whether he checked the materials he had gathered. Rudiger confirms that he did. The documents contained information about missing people in Leatherbelk, locations where suspicious individuals gathered, and reports that several important figures had been seen near an abandoned factory. Hans suspects that the factory is their base of operations. While investigating, he also discovered that workers had been disappearing on the outskirts of the city. Rudiger immediately asks whether a family of 3 was among the missing, and Hans confirms that an entire family vanished. Understanding what this means, Rudiger decides that he must personally investigate the area. That night, in the industrial district outside the city, 2 guards complain about how boring their assignment has become and wonder how much longer they will have to remain there. They discuss how some of the experiments managed to escape and blame the incident on the boy they kidnapped. According to them, the child was not properly sedated, and when they attempted to increase the dosage, he resisted violently and caused a commotion. Worse still, no one expected his parents to become a problem. Even after being transformed into werewolves, the parents still cared about their son, which was why they escaped and attacked people. Convinced that all their suffering was the boy's fault, they continue complaining. Suddenly, footsteps echo through the tunnel. The 2 exchange glances and reach for their weapons, but before they can react, both are instantly killed. Their bodies collapse as heavy footsteps resound through the sewer passage. From the darkness emerges Rudiger, dressed entirely in black and concealing his face beneath a hood and mask. Earlier, Hans had questioned Rudiger about his outfit and asked whether he intended to infiltrate the base alone. When Rudiger asked whether Hans would accompany him if requested, Hans admitted that he could probably defeat 2 opponents at most. Rudiger therefore insisted on going alone. However, Hans warned him that nearly 40 people were inside the facility, all of them armed, including 2 mages. He also pointed out a sewer grate that could serve as an entrance. Before leaving, Rudiger asked Hans about the missing family, and specifically about the age of their son. Upon learning that the child was only 7 years old, Rudiger was overwhelmed with guilt over what he had done. Pushing those thoughts aside, he infiltrates the Black Dawn Society's hideout. As he advances deeper into the base, the sounds echoing through the corridors make it obvious that he is eliminating anyone who stands in his way. By the time he reaches the deeper sections, a trail of corpses lies behind him. Unbeknownst to him, a bee emerges from one of the bodies and begins observing him. Inside the base, workers continue moving crates while discussing the mysterious intruder. At first, they assume that the attacker belongs to the security division. However, those observing through the spy bee quickly realize that the infiltrator is not one of their own. Deciding that killing him will not cause any problems, they order everyone to open fire. A barrage of bullets is unleashed, but Rudiger calmly blocks the attack with a magical barrier. Realizing that their opponent is a mage, the henchmen immediately abandon their firearms and draw swords instead. Rudiger responds by drawing his own gun. The men mock him, explaining that firearms are useless inside the silent zone. Before they can react, however, Rudiger instantly kills one of them. It is then revealed that his bullets are infused with mana, allowing them to function despite the zone's restrictions. Terrified, the remaining henchmen attempt to flee, but an armored man carrying a massive weapon steps forward. The armored fighter confidently boasts that a single shot from his advanced weapon, which resembles a bazooka, will be enough to kill Rudiger. Laughing, he fires a devastating energy blast. To his horror, Rudiger blocks the attack with a spell enhanced by both metal attributes and alchemy. Realizing that the metallic nature of the barrier should make it vulnerable to electricity, the man prepares another attack. Before he can fire, Rudiger shoots the energy tube attached to the man's back. Mana surges through the damaged device, triggering a violent chain reaction that electrocutes the surrounding henchmen. With a single spell, nearly 10 enemies are defeated simultaneously. Looking upward, Rudiger senses something strange and immediately shoots the spy bee attached to the ceiling. Confirming that he has been under surveillance, he suspects the infamous insect-controlling siblings from the underworld are involved. Rather than wasting time hunting each insect individually, Rudiger stomps the ground and releases magical vibrations. Invisible waves spread through the air, instantly killing every airborne insect. Elsewhere, the insect handler suddenly loses contact with all of his spies. Before the connection vanished, he detected unusual sound waves and realized that Rudiger possesses both metal and wind-based magic. Understanding that ordinary insects are ineffective against such abilities, he decides to unleash a far larger creature. He orders his partner, Veron, to prepare. The men brace themselves, certain that the intruder will enter through the door at any moment. Instead, the lights suddenly go out. Believing the infiltrator is toying with them by cutting the power, the blonde brother calls out to Veron, only to discover that Veron's head has already been severed. Horrified, he realizes that the intruder entered the room moments after the electricity failed. Desperate, he releases a giant centipede-like insect from his sleeve. At that exact moment, he notices the hooded intruder standing directly behind him. Rudiger raises his cane and prepares to strike. The criminal cannot understand why a mage is fighting in close combat and begins panicking as Rudiger instantly casts Floating Flame. The man is horrified when he realizes the spell was completed almost instantly. Before he can react, flames engulf him and send him crashing across the room. The surviving henchmen watch in shock as their boss burns alive. As the man demands to know the identity of the intruder, Rudiger calmly points his gun at him and fires. The gunshot echoes through the room, leaving everyone stunned by how easily the infamous insect brothers were defeated. When Rudiger turns toward the remaining enemies, his cold and merciless gaze terrifies them. Suddenly, something massive attacks him from behind. Rudiger narrowly dodges a gigantic insect leg emerging from Veron's headless corpse. Although decapitated, the body still moves. A grotesque mouth appears on the creature's hand, speaking as though nothing happened. The being remarks that it never expected to be ambushed or for both brothers to be defeated so quickly. Rudiger realizes that the creature has surpassed human limits. Moments later, a massive insect body bursts from Veron's abdomen. A gigantic green leg crashes onto the floor, and an enormous insect monster emerges. The creature claims that it does not mourn its younger brother's death. The terrified henchmen immediately flee as the monster attacks indiscriminately, crushing allies and enemies alike. The monstrous insect relentlessly pursues Rudiger, forcing him to dodge while questioning whether it feels no concern for its own subordinates. Rudiger opens fire with his mana-powered revolver, but the bullets barely scratch the creature's hardened exoskeleton. In response, the monster launches devastating attacks with its enormous legs. Retreating, Rudiger casts Flickering Flame, yet the giant centipede astonishingly dodges despite its immense size. The beast then seizes Rudiger in its claws. Trapped, Rudiger casts another spell directly against the creature at point-blank range. Even after the explosion, the smoke clears to reveal that the monster remains almost completely unharmed. The creature mockingly tells him that anything less than a 4th-tier spell is insufficient to burn it. With a tremendous roar, it attacks again, but Rudiger suddenly vanishes. After smashing through a wall and finding nothing, the monster realizes that Rudiger is clinging to the ceiling above. It destroys a supporting pillar to bring him down, but Rudiger swiftly evades once more. The creature remarks that the young mage is incredibly fast, just like its insects. Rudiger realizes that neither conventional weapons nor 3rd-tier magic will be enough. At the same time, he knows that the monster will never allow him enough time to cast a 4th-tier spell. With a dark expression, Rudiger reluctantly decides to use a method he never wanted to rely upon. Sensing a dangerous change, The monster watches as Rudiger declares that he has no other choice and begins casting a new spell. Meanwhile, outside the factory, Hans shivers in the cold and regrets not bringing a coat. He assumes the battle should have ended by now, although he also realizes that facing 2 dark mages alone cannot be easy. As he looks toward the factory, an intense and blinding light suddenly bursts from within. A massive explosion of energy erupts from the building, engulfing the entire area in flames. Seeing the factory consumed by fire, Hans immediately realizes that Rudiger has resorted to using true magic. To Hans, any overwhelmingly powerful spell qualifies as true magic, and he wonders what kind of technique Rudiger just unleashed. Soon afterward, Rudiger emerges from the burning facility. When Hans asks what happened, Rudiger calmly replies that he dealt with everything, including the experimental subjects. Hans asks whether there was any possibility of saving them, but Rudiger answers that there was none, which is why he had no choice but to eliminate them. They confirm that the experiments involved a drug capable of transforming humans, and Hans suspects that a powerful individual must be sponsoring the operation. Rudiger tells him not to worry because he has already discovered the mastermind behind the entire experiment. Hans cannot believe that his friend has already identified the culprit. Knowing that he will never be able to stop Rudiger once he sets his mind on something, Hans gives up and heads back to their hideout while Rudiger remains alone, silently watching the factory burn to ashes. Elsewhere, during an extravagant dinner, an elderly noble named Belford Rickson angrily throws a plate at one of his servants. Filled with contempt, he insults his maids, mocks their poor backgrounds, and declares that they are unworthy of eating the same food as him. Frustrated by what he considers incompetent staff, Belford complains about the enormous amount of money he invested in the experimental subjects, who were ultimately not managed properly. Although he does not know who is responsible for the failure, he hopes that someone has already taken care of the escaped subjects. Despite the setback, he remains convinced that the experiment will soon bear fruit. His ultimate goal is to use the drug to restore his body to its youthful prime. He dreams not only of regaining his youth, but also of becoming stronger and more perfect than ever before. To him, the years he sacrificed while building his fortune will finally be returned. Standing on Belford's balcony, a masked and hooded Rudiger suddenly calls out his name. Startled, Belford demands to know who the intruder is, only to be instantly thrown to the ground and restrained. The old noble desperately screams for his guards, but Rudiger calmly informs him that no one will come because a sound barrier now covers the entire room. Rudiger explains that he has only one question. He brings up the 7-year-old boy who should have remained human instead of being transformed into a monster alongside his parents. He speaks about how the child smiled gratefully at the very person who was about to kill him, and asks Belford how he thinks that person felt in that moment. Still pinned to the floor, Belford merely chuckles after realizing that Rudiger was responsible for killing the test subjects. Claiming that there must be some misunderstanding, Belford suggests resolving the matter through discussion. He argues that the experimental subjects were worthless people whom no one cared about, and insists that he had actually given them a second chance to contribute to humanity's evolution. When he proudly describes their suffering as a noble sacrifice, Rudiger cuts him off and says that his answer is more than enough. Without another word, Rudiger injects Belford with an entire vial of the experimental serum. Horrified, Belford screams as terror overwhelms him. Rudiger explains that according to the records, even a small amount of the serum is enough to transform a person into a werewolf. Curious about the effects of a full dose, he decided to test it on Belford himself. The old noble soon begins mutating, screaming in agony as madness overtakes him. His body twists into a grotesque, multi-armed werewolf, gigantic and utterly monstrous. Rudiger remarks that Belford could never understand the pain endured by the test subjects, no matter how much it was explained to him. That is why he chose to make Belford experience the same suffering firsthand. After removing the sound barrier, Belford's servants finally hear his agonizing screams and rush toward his quarters in panic. Instead of finding their master, they discover a horrifying monster. Unsure where it came from, they immediately attack it with magic and order someone to search for Belford. Even after unleashing fire spells, the creature refuses to die, forcing the guards to intensify their attacks while conserving mana. Later, at the hideout, Rudiger instructs Hans to organize the materials they collected and store the rest. Hans encourages him to inspect the hideout, reminding him that securing the location required tremendous effort. Rudiger replies that he will take a look during his next visit. He also states that when he returns, he intends to operate from a more suitable position within the underworld. Walking alone through the cold streets of Leatherbelk, Rudiger continues his mission. At one point, he notices a ship anchored silently in the middle of the sea. Clenching his fists in anger, he stares at the vessel for a long moment, seemingly plotting something. Soon, news spreads regarding the sudden death of Belford Rickson. Journalists gather outside his mansion, discussing how the guards discovered only a monstrous creature instead of Belford himself. Rumors that Belford had been involved in forbidden magic now appear to be true. Reporters mention that it took the guards an entire hour to subdue the monster. They are shocked when the Department of Security arrives alongside the elite Nightcrawler Knights. Leading the operation is Protector Lord Tarina Lionhowl. Since the press is denied entry, the journalists decide to question the commander instead. Meanwhile, a nervous guard stationed at the entrance hesitates when Tarina orders him to open the gate. Claiming that he was instructed to allow no one inside, The guard attempts to refuse. However, Tarina's cold gaze and overwhelming presence force both guards to obey immediately. Once inside, Inspector T-Born introduces himself. Tarina praises his efforts, but informs him that the Department of Security will now take over the investigation. She also requests every piece of evidence and information gathered so far before dismissing him. Although shocked, T-Born ultimately complies and orders his men to withdraw. Some of the younger members of the security team struggle to maintain their composure, prompting their senior, Lloyd, to reprimand them and remind them that they must always uphold the organization's reputation. Tarina reassures them that relaxing is acceptable when the press is absent, but she insists that they remember why they came. Eventually, they discover the massive, grotesque corpse of the monster. After examining it, Tarina concludes that Belford was involved not only in dark magic, but also in cryptid research. The fact that a monster suddenly appeared and killed him cannot be a coincidence. Lloyd adds that witness testimonies support the theory that the creature appeared out of nowhere before Belford died. Simply by observing the corpse, they determined that it had been burned all the way down to its internal organs. The knights then proceed to investigate the mansion itself. While examining a portrait of a woman, Tarina notices that the wallpaper behind it remains untouched by fire. Finding this suspicious, she moves the painting aside and discovers a hidden compartment. Although Lloyd initially assumes that the space once contained a safe filled with illicit money, Tarina notes that the compartment is now empty. Judging by its dimensions and placement, she agrees that it was likely used to conceal a safe. However, the absence of dust at the back of the compartment suggests that the safe was removed very recently. To Tarina, the sudden appearance of the monster, Belford's death, and the disappearance of the safe are clearly connected. She suspects the involvement of a highly skilled third party who managed to leave no evidence behind. The only individual she knows capable of such a feat is Arsène Lupin. Although Lloyd does not recognize the name, Tarina offers no explanation. Instead, she asks whether any other unusual incidents have occurred recently in Letherbelk. Upon learning that an abandoned factory in the industrial district burned down shortly before Belford's death, Tarina concludes that the location must hold important clues and immediately decides to investigate it.